The cruelest crowns are never made of gold. They are forged from the moments when the whole world decides someone is worth less than everyone else. Before the first rays of dawn slipped over the rolling fields of Ashcroft Valley, the harvest feast had already begun to awaken. Lanterns glowed beneath towering oak trees. Wagons loaded with pumpkins, apples, and golden wheat rolled toward the village square, and the crisp scent of cinnamon, fresh bread, and wood smoke drifted through the cool autumn air. Every family wore their finest clothes for the kingdom's most cherished celebration, the one day each year when the Alpha King personally honored the pack whose harvest had blessed the realm. Laughter echoed through the streets as children raced between market stalls. Musicians tuned fiddles beneath colorful banners, and merchants proudly displayed jars of amber honey beside baskets overflowing with bright red apples. It was supposed to be a day that reminded everyone the kingdom prospered because every wolf contributed. Yet for Emily Carter, the harvest feast had never felt like a celebration. It was simply the longest day of the year. While others admired the decorations, Emily carried heavy wooden crates from Sunrise, her simple cream-colored dress already dusted with flour and straw before most guests had even arrived. She quietly stacked baskets beside the grand pavilion, careful not to disturb anyone important. Her pale skin had turned rosy from the chilly morning air, and loose strands of chestnut hair escaped the braid that rested across one shoulder. She moved with practiced silence, almost invisible despite the growing crowd around her. That was how life had taught her to survive. Invisible people rarely became targets. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. An elderly baker smiled kindly as she accepted another basket from Emily. "You're here before everyone else again." Emily answered with the same gentle smile she offered every year. "Someone has to make sure the feast is ready." The baker nodded with quiet appreciation before disappearing into the crowd, leaving Emily alone once more. She glanced toward the enormous wooden platform rising in the center of the square. Draped with crimson banners embroidered in silver thread, it stood beneath an ancient oak where generations of Alpha Kings had presented the harvest crown. Every child in the kingdom dreamed of standing there one day. Emily had never allowed herself that dream. The harvest crown belonged to noble daughters, respected healers, celebrated warriors, and influential families. Never to an Omega whose greatest talent was making everyone else's day easier. As the morning brightened, elegant carriages began arriving one after another. Noble families stepped onto the cobblestones dressed in velvet cloaks trimmed with fine fur, exchanging polished smiles while servants rushed to carry their belongings. Emily lowered her eyes and continued arranging baskets of wheat near the stage, hoping no one would notice her. Unfortunately, hope had never been very dependable. A loud burst of laughter drifted across the square as several young women dressed in rich emerald and sapphire gowns approached the display she had just finished organizing. Their jeweled bracelets shimmered in the sunlight, and every confident step reminded the crowd exactly who they were. Emily instinctively tightened her grip on the empty basket in her hands. Somewhere beyond the growing celebration, the distant sound of ceremonial horns floated across the valley, announcing that the royal procession had crossed the eastern bridge. The Alpha King was finally coming. Almost everyone smiled with excitement. Emily simply lowered her head and kept working, unaware that before the autumn sun reached its highest point, every eye in the kingdom would know her name. Emily barely noticed the ceremonial horns fading into the distance as she hurried toward another wagon stacked with baskets of freshly harvested apples. Every task seemed to appear the moment she finished the last one. She welcomed the work because it kept her hands busy and her thoughts quiet. There was comfort in simple routines, even on a day when the entire kingdom seemed determined to celebrate everything she believed she would never become. She bent carefully to lift a wooden crate when a sharp voice cut through the cheerful chatter surrounding the square. "Watch where you are standing." Emily immediately stepped aside, lowering her eyes before she even recognized the speaker. Three young noblewomen swept toward the grand pavilion, their elegant gowns flowing behind them like colorful autumn leaves caught in the wind. At their center walked Victoria Ashford, daughter of one of the wealthiest families in the Northern Territories. Her polished smile never quite reached her pale blue eyes. She stopped directly in front of Emily and glanced slowly over the simple dress dusted with flour. I almost mistook a servant for part of the decorations, Victoria said with a soft laugh. The women beside her joined in without hesitation. Emily offered a respectful nod. I apologize if I was in your way. You were, another woman replied. You should remember that guests are meant to admire the feast, not the people carrying it. More laughter followed, light enough to sound harmless, yet sharp enough to settle heavily inside Emily's chest. She quietly picked up the crate again and started to walk around them, hoping the moment would end. Instead, Victoria reached out and lightly tapped the edge of the basket balanced on Emily's arm. Several bright red apples rolled across the cobblestones, scattering between polished boots and embroidered dresses. Gasps quickly turned into amused whispers as nearby spectators paused to watch. Emily immediately knelt and gathered the fruit one piece at a time. Oh dear, Victoria said with exaggerated concern. Perhaps the basket was simply too heavy. Or perhaps she thought crawling around would earn sympathy, another noblewoman added. Several people smiled politely while others looked away, pretending not to notice. No one stepped forward to help. Emily kept collecting the apples with steady hands even as warm embarrassment spread across her face. She reminded herself that arguing would only make everything worse. One apple rolled farther than the others, stopping beside the worn boots of an elderly woman carrying a bundle of herbs. Before Emily could reach it, the woman suddenly stumbled against the uneven stones. The bundle slipped from her hands, and dried lavender, sage, and rosemary scattered across the ground. Without thinking, Emily abandoned the remaining apples and hurried toward her. Are you all right? She asked gently, offering both hands to help the woman regain her balance. I am now, the woman answered with a grateful smile. Emily carefully gathered every herb, brushing away loose dust before placing them neatly back into the basket. She even noticed one cracked glass bottle of homemade medicine and wrapped it inside a clean linen cloth from her apron to keep it from breaking. The elderly woman squeezed Emily's hand with quiet appreciation. Kindness is remembered longer than pride, child. Emily smiled softly, unaware that someone else had heard every word. Across the crowded square, partially hidden beneath the shade of the ancient oak, a tall man wearing a dark traveling cloak stood without speaking. Unlike everyone else, he had not laughed when the apples rolled across the stones. His silver eyes followed Emily as she returned to gathering the scattered fruit, noticing how she thanked the elderly woman instead of expecting thanks herself. Around him, royal guards remained just far enough away to avoid drawing attention, allowing the stranger to observe the celebration unnoticed. While the crowd admired expensive gowns, polished jewelry, and carefully rehearsed smiles, his attention never left the quiet Omega, who seemed to carry more grace and silence than others displayed through wealth. Emily lifted the final apple, placed it back into the basket, and continued toward the pavilion without once looking behind her, never realizing that the most powerful man in the kingdom had just witnessed the smallest act of kindness at the entire harvest feast. The warmth of the late morning sun settled over Ashcroft Valley as more wagons filled the village square, and every bell that chimed from the chapel tower reminded the crowd that the harvest ceremony would begin within the hour. Excitement rippled through the gathering like a gentle breeze through golden wheat. Families claimed places near the great platform beneath the ancient oak. Merchants polished the last of their displays, and musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies that seemed to promise another perfect festival. Emily carried one final basket of braided harvest bread toward the long banquet tables, quietly weaving through the growing crowd with practiced care. She kept her eyes lowered, hoping the uncomfortable encounter from earlier had already been forgotten. For a few peaceful moments, it almost seemed possible. Then Victoria's familiar voice floated across the square once again. There she is. Emily stopped instinctively. Victoria approached with the same graceful confidence, surrounded by several young women whose jeweled gowns attracted almost as much attention as their laughter. A few influential families turned to watch, curious to see what would happen next. The harvest feast deserves someone worthy to welcome the Alpha King, Victoria announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Not someone who belongs behind the storage wagons. Soft chuckles spread through the crowd. Emily tightened her fingers around the basket, but answered calmly. I am only finishing my work. Exactly, Victoria replied. Work. That is all an omega like you should ever expect. One of the women beside her smiled as if inspiration had suddenly struck. Perhaps she should help entertain everyone while we wait. Every celebration needs a little amusement. Another added with a playful grin. Maybe she could stand beside the stage so visitors remember how fortunate they are. More laughter followed. None of the words were shouted, yet each one settled over the square with quiet cruelty. Emily felt dozens of eyes studying her, measuring her silence instead of her character. She could have walked away. She almost did. Instead, she carefully placed the basket onto the nearest table before speaking in the gentlest voice she could manage. I hope today brings joy to everyone. The unexpected answer caught several people off guard. Victoria blinked before forcing another smile. Still pretending kindness makes people important? Emily simply lowered her head again. Kindness makes every day easier. Victoria looked almost disappointed that she had failed to provoke the reaction she wanted. With a dismissive wave of her hand, she turned toward the platform, leading her companions away as their conversation shifted to gowns, titles, and who might receive the Alpha King's attention. Around them, the crowd slowly returned to its own conversations, but not everyone had looked away. The elderly woman Emily had helped earlier remained near the herb stall, quietly watching with thoughtful eyes. Beside her stood a young boy holding a carved wooden toy wolf. He tugged gently on her sleeve and whispered, "Why were they so mean to the lady who helped you?" The woman smiled sadly. "Because some people only recognize value when it shines like gold." The boy frowned. She seemed brighter than gold. Before the woman could answer, another figure stepped beside them. The traveler in the dark cloak had returned, his silver eyes resting on Emily as she continued arranging chairs for guests who had never once thanked her. "Did you know her?" he asked. "Only for a moment," the elderly woman replied. "Long enough to know her heart." The stranger gave a quiet nod, saying nothing more. His gaze followed Emily as she paused to straighten a child's fallen scarf before quietly moving another chair so an older guest would have more room to sit. She never looked toward the platform where the kingdom's most honored families gathered. She never noticed the respectful glances beginning to replace curious ones among those who had witnessed her small acts throughout the morning. While many prepared speeches to impress the Alpha King, Emily continued serving strangers without expecting recognition, unaware that every quiet choice she made was becoming impossible for one silent observer to ignore. The first deep note of the ceremonial horn rolled across Ashcroft Valley, and every conversation dissolved into expectant silence. Hundreds of guests turned toward the great platform beneath the ancient oak as members of the Royal Council stepped into position, their emerald robes catching the afternoon sunlight. Crimson banners swayed gently above them while golden leaves drifted through the crisp autumn air, settling across the polished wooden stage like nature itself had come to witness the ceremony. Emily quietly wiped her hands on her linen apron after placing the final pitcher of fresh cider onto the banquet table. Her work was finished at last. She planned to slip behind the kitchens where servants usually remained until the festivities ended, but before she could take another step, a clear, commanding voice echoed across the square. "All unmarried women of the pack are to gather before the platform for the blessing of the harvest." Emily stopped. The announcement was an old tradition. Every year the Alpha King offered words of encouragement to the kingdom's young women before presenting the harvest crown to someone whose character represented the spirit of the season. Most believed only daughters of noble houses truly belonged in that gathering. Emily quietly looked around, hoping no one would notice her standing alone near the edge of the crowd. "You heard the councilman," an older servant whispered kindly. "Go. It is required." Emily hesitated only a moment before nodding. She slowly joined the growing line of young women assembling before the stage. Velvet dresses shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Necklaces of polished amber and silver reflected warm light. Laughter and whispered conversations filled the air as confident smiles spread from one elegant face to another. Emily immediately recognized that she did not belong among them. Her simple cream-colored dress, faded from years of careful washing, stood in quiet contrast to every embroidered gown surrounding her. She instinctively stepped toward the very end of the line, hoping to become invisible once again. Unfortunately, someone noticed exactly where she had gone. Victoria glanced over her shoulder before exchanging amused looks with her companions. She slowly walked toward Emily until she stood only a few feet away. "You cannot honestly believe this ceremony includes you," she said softly enough that only those nearby could hear. Emily answered with respectful calm. The announcement was for every unmarried woman. Victoria smiled politely, although there was no warmth behind it. Tradition may say everyone, but everyone knows who the Alpha King actually comes to see. A few women nearby laughed under their breath. Another adjusted the jeweled ribbon woven through her golden hair before adding, "Perhaps she misunderstood the difference between being invited and simply being present." Emily looked down at her folded hands. She refused to argue. Silence had protected her many times before. The royal master of ceremonies began walking slowly along the line, greeting each participant with a welcoming smile. Noble daughters curtsied gracefully as he passed. Parents watched proudly from the crowd, exchanging hopeful glances about who might receive recognition this year. When the official finally reached Emily, his pleasant expression faltered for only a brief moment. He looked at the apron still tied around her waist, and then at the flower lightly dusting the sleeves of her dress. "You have been working?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Emily answered honestly. Before he could respond, Victoria spoke with practiced sweetness. She volunteered to help with the serving tables. She is much more comfortable there than on a stage. Quiet laughter spread through several nearby guests. The official offered Emily an apologetic smile that somehow felt even heavier than open criticism. "Perhaps it would be easier if you remained toward the back," he suggested gently. "There will be many distinguished visitors arriving shortly." Emily simply nodded and took 2 small steps farther behind everyone else. No complaint left her lips. No disappointment appeared on her face. Yet from beneath the ancient oak, hidden among honored guests and royal attendants, the silent traveler watched every moment unfold. His expression never changed, but those standing closest to him noticed something unexpected. The warmth had disappeared from his silver eyes, replaced by a calm stillness that carried the quiet weight of approaching judgment. Another blast of the ceremonial horns echoed across the valley, deeper and more powerful than before. Every conversation ended instantly. Musicians lowered their instruments. Merchants stepped away from their stalls. Even restless children grew quiet as the massive oak gates at the eastern entrance slowly swung open. The royal procession entered with measured dignity, led by mounted guards wearing polished silver armor that reflected the afternoon sunlight like flowing water. Behind them came standard-bearers carrying the black wolf banner of the crown, followed by members of the royal council dressed in dark emerald robes trimmed with silver thread. The crowd bowed respectfully as the procession advanced toward the great platform. Emily remained near the back of the assembled women, lowering her head with everyone else. She expected only to catch a distant glimpse of the Alpha King before quietly returning to the kitchens once the ceremony ended. Instead, she noticed something that made her heart pause. The mysterious traveler in the dark cloak was nowhere to be seen. For a brief moment, she wondered where he had gone. Then the royal herald raised an ornate staff toward the platform. His Majesty, Alpha King Adrian Blackwood. A wave of respectful silence swept through the square as one final figure climbed the broad wooden steps. He wore no traveling cloak now. Instead, a tailored black ceremonial coat rested across his broad shoulders, fastened with a silver clasp shaped like a wolf beneath the full moon. His dark hair moved gently in the autumn breeze, and his calm silver eyes carried the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to demand attention because his presence commanded it naturally. Emily felt her breath catch. It was him, the quiet traveler who had wandered unnoticed through the harvest feast, the man who had watched without interrupting, the stranger who had spoken gently with the elderly woman. He had been the Alpha King all along. Around the square, astonished whispers spread among those who suddenly recognized him as well. Victoria's confident smile faded almost imperceptibly before she quickly straightened her posture, hoping to recover her composure. Several noble families exchanged nervous glances, replaying every moment of the morning in their minds. Adrian slowly surveyed the gathering from the platform. His gaze moved across the musicians, the decorated tables, the overflowing harvest displays, and the hundreds of citizens who had come to celebrate another prosperous season. He acknowledged each group with a small nod before allowing his eyes to continue across the line of unmarried women standing before him. One after another, hopeful faces brightened as his attention briefly passed over them. Some lifted their chins with carefully practiced grace. Others offered polished smiles that reflected years of etiquette lessons. Emily kept her head lowered, convinced he would never notice the servant standing behind everyone else. Then she sensed something impossible. The silence lingered longer than expected. Curious murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Slowly, Emily looked up. Adrian's silver eyes were resting directly on her. There was no confusion in his expression, no hesitation, only calm recognition. It lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt strangely untouched by the noise surrounding them. Emily instinctively glanced behind herself, wondering if he had been looking at someone else. There was no one there. His attention had never shifted. The Alpha King offered the smallest hint of a smile before turning his gaze back toward the gathered crowd. The moment passed so quietly that most people almost questioned whether it had happened at all. But several had seen it. Victoria had seen it. The Royal Council had seen it. The elderly woman smiled to herself without saying a word. Even the young boy holding the carved wooden wolf stared at Emily with wide eyes as though he had just witnessed the beginning of something no one else yet understood. Emily lowered her gaze once more, her heart beating faster than it ever had before. She could not explain what had just happened. She only knew that for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her as though she truly deserved to be seen. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound of the royal horns had ever been. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stood at the center of the platform with one hand resting lightly on the carved wooden railing, his expression composed as his silver eyes moved across the crowd once more. The breeze stirred the crimson banners overhead, carrying with it the scent of fresh wheat and fallen leaves, yet no one seemed to notice. Hundreds of people waited for him to begin the traditional address that opened every harvest ceremony. Instead, Adrian spoke a single unexpected sentence. "Before we celebrate this year's abundance, I wish to understand something I witnessed this morning." Confused murmurs spread quietly through the audience. Members of the Royal Council exchanged uncertain glances. This was not part of the ceremony anyone remembered. Adrian allowed the silence to linger before continuing. A kingdom reveals its true character long before a feast begins. His gaze drifted toward the line of unmarried women once again, stopping briefly on Emily before returning to the crowd. "I observed generosity. I observed humility. I also observed how easily people judge another without knowing their heart." Emily felt every word settle deep inside her chest, although she still could not imagine he was speaking about her. Victoria stepped forward slightly, wearing the same polished smile she had practiced for years at public gatherings. "Your Majesty," she said with graceful confidence, "today is meant to honor the finest among us. We are grateful that you have come to celebrate our traditions." Adrian inclined his head politely. "Traditions matter." His calm voice never rose. "Especially the traditions we choose to preserve." Victoria's smile remained, but uncertainty flickered behind her eyes. Hoping to recover the attention of the gathering, she laughed softly and gestured toward the line of women. "Everyone understands that certain responsibilities belong to certain people. Servants serve. Noble families lead. That is simply the natural order." Several guests nodded cautiously. Others remained silent, waiting for the Alpha King's response. Adrian looked toward Victoria with the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. "Those are your words." Victoria answered without hesitation. "Yes, Your Majesty." Adrian gave one slow nod. "Please repeat them." The request sounded gentle, almost conversational. Yet an uncomfortable stillness immediately settled over the square. Victoria blinked. "Your Majesty? Repeat exactly what you just said." She looked briefly toward the surrounding nobles as though searching for reassurance. None came. "I only meant that every person has an appropriate place." Adrian remained perfectly still. "And who decides that place?" No one answered. Even the autumn breeze seemed to disappear. Emily lowered her eyes, wishing the conversation would end before anyone became embarrassed because of her. She had never wanted to become the center of anyone's attention. Adrian slowly descended the first step of the platform, not with anger, but with quiet purpose. "This morning," he said, "I watched a young woman stop her own work to help an elderly citizen who had fallen. I watched her gather scattered belongings with care while others laughed nearby. I watched her continue serving this celebration after being treated as though kindness carried no value. His words drifted gently through the crowd, and with each sentence more faces turned toward Emily. The elderly woman nodded almost imperceptibly. The little boy clutched his carved wooden wolf and smiled with quiet certainty. Victoria's confident posture began to falter as realization settled across her face. Adrian stopped at the bottom of the platform and looked across the assembly. "Tell me," he asked softly, "which deserves greater honor today? A title inherited at birth, or a heart that chooses compassion when no one is watching?" No one answered because suddenly the question no longer belonged only to the harvest feast. It belonged to every person standing in the square. No one moved. The question lingered above the square like the final golden leaves clinging to the branches of the ancient oak. Emily wished she could disappear into the crowd once more, but every pair of eyes now seemed to find her without effort. She had spent years trying not to be noticed, and suddenly the entire valley was looking at her. Alpha King Adrian allowed the silence to speak for itself before turning toward the royal council. "Bring forward the witnesses." A quiet ripple of surprise spread across the gathering. Witnesses? No one had expected testimony to become part of the harvest ceremony. The elderly woman from the herb stall stepped forward first, leaning gently on her wooden cane. She bowed respectfully before the Alpha King. Adrian acknowledged her with a warm nod. "Please tell everyone what happened this morning." The woman smiled softly as she looked toward Emily. "I lost my balance because my old knees are not as steady as they once were. My medicines fell across the stones, and before anyone else even noticed, this young woman was beside me. She gathered every herb as though each one mattered. She wrapped the cracked bottle so I would not lose the medicine my husband depends on every evening. She expected nothing in return. She thanked me instead." A thoughtful silence settled over the crowd. Adrian nodded once before looking toward another familiar face. "There is one more." The little boy holding the carved wooden wolf stepped forward, encouraged by his grandmother's gentle smile. He looked no older than 8, and his nervous hands clutched the toy tightly against his chest. "What did you see?" Adrian asked kindly. The boy swallowed before answering. "I saw the ladies laugh when the apples rolled away. I thought Miss Emily might cry." His innocent voice carried farther than anyone expected. But she did not get angry. She helped Grandma first. Then she smiled at me when I picked up one apple. She even thanked me. He looked toward Emily with complete sincerity. Nobody thanks children very much. Several parents lowered their eyes. The words struck with a quiet honesty that no elegant speech could match. Adrian smiled gently at the boy. "Thank you for telling the truth." The child nodded proudly before returning to his grandmother's side. Emily felt warmth rising to her face. She remembered neither moment as extraordinary. To her, they had simply been ordinary choices made during an ordinary morning. That was what confused her most. Why did everyone suddenly care? Adrian slowly faced the crowd again. "This kingdom often celebrates great victories," he said. "We honor successful harvests, prosperous families, and remarkable achievements. Those are worthy traditions." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "But I have learned that character reveals itself most clearly in moments when no reward is expected." His silver eyes found Emily once more. Compassion offered in silence carries more strength than kindness performed for applause. Across the front row, Victoria lowered her gaze for the first time all day. Her companions no longer smiled. The confidence that had surrounded them throughout the morning seemed strangely fragile now, replaced by uncomfortable reflection. Around the square, whispers gradually disappeared. Instead of studying gowns or family names, people began remembering the quiet servant who had arranged chairs, carried baskets, comforted an elderly stranger, thanked a child, and asked for nothing in return. Emily stood perfectly still, uncertain where to place her hands or how to respond to so much unexpected attention. She had never imagined that the smallest moments of her day had been seen so clearly. Adrian turned toward the ancient oak where a velvet cushion rested upon a carved pedestal. At its center lay the harvest crown, woven from polished golden leaves and delicate silver branches that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. The entire square instinctively followed his gaze. Everyone knew what came next according to tradition. Yet for the first time in many generations, no one felt certain whose name the Alpha King was about to speak. The harvest crown rested upon its velvet cushion, catching the afternoon sunlight until it seemed almost alive with golden light. For generations, it had symbolized honor, wisdom, and the gratitude of an entire kingdom. Every year, noble families quietly imagined hearing one of their own names spoken. This year, the silence stretching across Ashcroft Valley carried something entirely different. It carried uncertainty. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood stepped toward the ancient oak and lifted the crown with both hands. No one breathed. The woven branches of polished silver and golden leaves reflected in his calm eyes as he slowly turned back toward the waiting crowd. Every hopeful face followed his movement. Emily lowered her gaze once more, convinced the ceremony would finally continue according to tradition. She never imagined the next words would change her life forever. Adrian's steady voice carried effortlessly across the square. Today we celebrate a harvest created by countless hands. He paused before continuing. Fields are planted by strength. Homes are sustained by kindness. Neither can flourish without the other. He descended the final steps of the platform, still holding the harvest crown. Confused whispers spread through the gathered nobles as they watched their king walk past every distinguished family waiting near the front. Victoria straightened instinctively, expecting him to stop before her. He did not. Another respected family bowed politely as he passed. He continued walking. Every step carried him farther from wealth, titles, and influence. Every step brought him closer to the quiet Omega standing alone behind everyone else. Emily realized too late that he was approaching her. Her heart raced as she instinctively stepped backward. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think there has been a mistake." Adrian stopped only a few feet away. His expression remained warm, composed, and completely certain. "There has," he answered gently, "but it was not yours." Emily looked up, unable to understand what he meant. The Alpha King smiled with quiet kindness. The mistake was believing that worth could be measured by status instead of character. Around them, the entire square stood frozen. Even the autumn breeze seemed unwilling to disturb the moment. Adrian slowly raised the harvest crown. "Emily Carter," he said clearly enough for every voice in the valley to hear. "This morning you reminded your kingdom that compassion does not ask who deserves help before offering it. You served without expecting praise. You showed dignity when others offered disrespect. You chose kindness when no one believed your actions mattered." His silver eyes never left hers. "That is the spirit this crown was always meant to honor." With careful hands, he gently placed the harvest crown upon Emily's head. The delicate silver branches settled softly against her chestnut hair as sunlight shimmered across the golden leaves. For one breathtaking moment, complete silence embraced the valley. Then something extraordinary happened. One elderly woman began to applaud. The little boy joined her with joyful enthusiasm. A village baker followed, then another merchant. Then families across the square rose to their feet one after another until applause echoed beneath the ancient oak like rolling thunder carried on the autumn wind. Emily stood completely still, tears gathering in her eyes as she looked around in disbelief. The same people who had barely noticed her only hours earlier were now smiling with genuine admiration. Adrian stepped beside her and addressed the crowd one final time. "Let every harvest feast after this day remember one truth. A kingdom is not defined by those who stand above others. It is defined by those who quietly lift others when no one is watching." He offered Emily a respectful nod instead of standing above her. It was not merely the honoring of one humble Omega. It was the beginning of a new tradition, one that every person gathered beneath the ancient oak knew they would remember for the rest of their lives. The applause continued long after the harvest crown had found its rightful place. It echoed across Ashcroft Valley, rolling over the golden fields and disappearing into the distant forests as though the land itself had chosen to remember that afternoon. Emily Carter stood beneath the ancient oak with tears shimmering in her eyes, not because she had been honored, but because for the first time in her life she no longer felt invisible. The weight resting upon her head was surprisingly light. The true weight was carried inside her heart, where years of quiet endurance had finally been met with something she had never expected to receive. Respect. Around the square, Families who had overlooked her only hours before now greeted her with warm smiles instead of hurried glances. The elderly baker stepped forward first and gently squeezed her hand. "I always knew your kindness mattered," he said. The elderly woman embraced Emily with grandmotherly affection, while the little boy proudly held up his carved wooden wolf as if celebrating the greatest victory he had ever witnessed. One by one, villagers approached not because the Alpha King had instructed them to do so, but because something inside them had quietly changed. Even those who had laughed earlier struggled to meet Emily's eyes. Victoria remained where she stood, watching the celebration with thoughtful silence. The confidence that had surrounded her throughout the morning had disappeared, replaced by quiet reflection. After several long moments, she slowly walked toward Emily. The crowd instinctively fell silent again. Emily looked at her without anger, carrying the same gentle expression she had worn since sunrise. Victoria lowered her head. "I believe titles made people important," she admitted softly. "Today I learned I was wrong." Emily answered with the kindness that had never abandoned her. "We all learn in different seasons." There was no bitterness in her voice, no triumph, only grace. Victoria looked up with visible surprise before offering the smallest grateful smile. It was the beginning of humility, something wealth had never been able to teach her. Nearby, members of the royal council quietly discussed the ceremony that had just unfolded. More than one admitted they had never seen the Alpha King alter centuries of expectation with such calm certainty. Adrian stood at the edge of the platform, watching the people instead of the celebration. He had not simply presented a crown. He had restored the meaning behind it. His trusted advisor approached and asked quietly, "Your Majesty, do you believe the kingdom will accept such a change?" Adrian smiled as families from every corner of the valley gathered around Emily, speaking to her with genuine warmth. "They already have," he replied. As the afternoon faded into a sky painted with shades of amber and crimson, music filled the square once again. This time, however, the laughter sounded different. It was softer, kinder. Children invited Emily to join a harvest dance, and she accepted with shy laughter that carried farther than she realized. The villagers no longer saw a poor Omega standing among them. They saw the woman who had reminded them that greatness often walks quietly through ordinary days. Before leaving the celebration, Adrian looked back one final time. Emily was smiling as she helped the elderly woman find a comfortable seat beneath the oak, still serving others even while wearing the harvest crown. He nodded almost to himself, as though a silent promise had been fulfilled. The autumn wind gently stirred the silver leaves woven into her crown, and sunlight caught them one last time before evening settled over the valley. Years later, people would still tell their children about that harvest feast. They would not remember which family owned the largest fields or whose carriage had been the finest. They would remember the day a humble Omega taught an entire kingdom that true honor is never inherited, never purchased, and never demanded. It is earned one quiet act of kindness at a time, especially when no one believes anyone is watching.